Weapon weight is something I don't hear discussed too much, but it's been a mechanic since the beginning of the Fire Emblem series, and it appears in most entries, even being prominently featured in some ROM hacks like The Last Promise.
How much weight can you handle?
Thanks, Kellic. Anyway, let's take a look at what weight has looked like in each iteration of Fire Emblem, how that's impacted gameplay, and which ones I like best. Starting off, we have one of the simplest versions of weapon weights, which was used in the first 4 Fire Emblem games. In these games, weapon weight impacts all units roughly equally. When you attack, your attack speed is equal to your speed, minus the weapon's weight that you're using. So if you attack with Jagen in Chapter 1 of FE3 Book 1 with his Iron Lance, his attack speed is 2, which is his base speed of 8 minus the Iron Lance's weight of 6. The effective weapon weight is really straightforward in these games. Faster units get to use heavier weapons that deal more damage, and slower units are stuck on weaker weapons if they want to double. In that same chapter with Jagen, for example, most enemies have 0 attack speed, including the boss. This means Jagen is fast enough to double them, but only when using the Slim Lance that comes on Sita. On the flip side, Sita is fast enough that she can double enemies despite the speed loss from the Silver Lance. So you can make a clear of Chapter 1 a little more reliable by having Jagen fight the Scrub Pirates with the Slim Lance, and having Sita fight the boss with the Silver Lance. The way this weight system tends to affect units is that fast units often have low or middling strength, with the understanding that you can compensate for their low strength by doubling or using a heavier weapon. We can see a good example of this in a couple units in Chapter 2 of Fire Emblem 3 Book 1. Ogma joins our army with only 6 strength, while Barst joins with 10. That's a pretty wide gulf in Barst's favor, but Ogma comes with a 3-point speed lead and uses a lighter weapon type in swords compared to Barst's axes. Even though Barst has a 4-point strength lead, he never doubles because his lightest weapon weighs him down to an attack speed of 2, whereas Ogma's Iron Sword leaves him with 10 attack speed. Ogma can even go up to a higher weight weapon like Steel or Silver Sword, and still double while making up for his weight deficit with his higher speed. So basically, in this system, speed is a really important stat. A noteworthy quirk of this system, particularly in games where stat caps are the same for all units, is that you can easily make enemies that just can't be doubled by certain weapons. For example, a unit with 11 speed in Fire Emblem 3 cannot be doubled by any axe user, because the lightest axe in the game would weigh them down too much, even if their speed was at the cap. This is interesting design space, but unfortunately it has its harshest effect on axe users, who already struggle in FE3. I like this system for weapon weight because it's very simple. It's basic subtraction that applies to all units in the same way, so it's really easy to wrap your head around. However, an effect of it is that speed is insanely good. In our Barst Ogma example, we can see that a 4-point lead in strength, which sounds pretty big, actually doesn't matter that much since Ogma can double with higher weight weapons. A strength lead has to be pretty big to make up for the offensive shortcomings a unit has compared to another with better speed. I like that this weight system makes you at least think about who the best users of each weapon are though. I think it's rewarding to realize things like being able to make Chapter 1 more reliable by giving Jagen the Slim Lance. The existence of little optimizations like this encourages players to make decisions and be rewarded for making those decisions. The one area where high-strength, low-speed units can shine in these games is with effective weaponry, or killer weapons. With these weapons, often the damage you're dealing is near one-shotting an enemy, so having a bit of extra damage can put you over the top to where you don't take a counterattack. If you can one-shot an enemy, it's not such a big deal that you don't double. Generally though, this system really rewards units with good speed. To counteract this issue where speed is so dominant, Fire Emblem Thracia 776 added a new stat, Build. In Thracia, a unit's attack speed is equal to their speed minus the difference between their weapon's weight and their build. So for example, if a unit has 10 build, they don't lose any speed when using a 10 weight Iron Axe, but they lose 10 speed when using a 20 weight Devil Axe. This can allow slower units to have advantages with higher weight weapons, provided they have enough build. For example, a unit with 4 build and 11 speed functionally has 5 speed when using an Iron Axe, while a unit with 7 speed but 12 build would have their full 7 speed when they use that same axe. In this system, weapon weight is a little more complicated than speed being king. A unit with middling speed can sometimes get a leg up by using a heavier weapon if they have good build. Notably, in Thracia, build is a stat like any other, meaning it has a chance of improving when you level up. Most units have pretty low build growth rates though. Most units have growths in the 5 to 20% range for this stat, though everyone's favorite Marty has a build growth of 75%. This is also the system used in GBA Fire Emblem games, but with a few changes. First, in the GBA games it's called Constitution instead of Build. And it doesn't have a growth rate in this game, so outside of a rare stat booster, your con for a unit just is what it is. This system adds a little complexity to the weapon weight system, but something important to note is that if a unit is fast, they can still use weapons that weigh them down. A common sentiment is that low con can ruin a unit's ability to use heavy weapons, but that's only true sometimes. Let's look at a unit like Vanessa in Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. Vanessa starts with a pretty sad 5 con, meaning she loses speed to everything but a slim lance. A common argument made with Vanessa is that if she stays in Falco Knight, she can't use anything with high weapon weight, but this fails to account for her speed. Let's say Vanessa promotes in Chapter 9 at level 10. She averages 18 speed and 1 point of con on promotion, so now her con is 6. With an Iron Lance, she loses 2 points of speed, but her attack speed is still 16. That's going to be better than most units in your army and doubles the vast majority of enemies on Erika's version of Chapter 9. Even using a heavier weapon like a Silver Lance still leaves her with 14 speed, enough to double all but the fastest enemies here. On the other hand, if you don't have a great speed stat, low con starts to become a bigger problem. Let's look at Nami, a unit who joins at a similar time to Vanessa and with the same constitution. They even get the same +1 con on promotion. If we look at a promoted Nami in the same map though, we see a pretty big difference, because Nami only has 13 speed on average. So when she uses a steel bow, which weighs her down by 3, she can't double any of the pirates or fighters on the map. Basically, the point here is that even in the Constitution system, speed is still really good, because 1 point of speed can always fill the same role as a point of con, but 1 point of con only imitates a point of speed when a unit is weighed down by the weapon they're using. In short, speed is always as good or better than con, and if you're really fast, you get to ignore bad con to a certain extent. One issue I do feel the need to point out with this system is that women characters often get pretty shafted by the Constitution system. In Sacred Stones, for example, women average a measly 5 con, while male characters average 9.6. That's a big gap. Of course, class distribution isn't the same for each gender, but looking at classes individually doesn't paint a better picture. Marissa has 5 con to Joshua's 8, Nami has 5 con to Inez's 8 after removing the 1 he gets for being a pre-promote. Perhaps most egregiously, Lute as a mage has 3 con to a trainee Ewan's 5 con. No one should have lower con than Ewan. He looks like a weak breeze would blow him over. As long as Ewan has the same con as the average woman in Sacred Stones, I will not accept realism as a reason for this con difference. And before someone says con isn't why female units are bad in these games, that's not my point. Obviously, con isn't the reason Nami and Marissa are bad, and Lute is actually even pretty decent. My point is simply that there's no real reason for there to be a massive constitution disparity split on gender lines, and I've never seen anyone argue for why this disparity is good, only that it's not as bad as people think. I don't think there's a good argument for this disparity existing on gendered lines. Mechanically, I find the weight system in these games interesting, and it has an impact on what weapons you choose between for each unit, but I would hope in the future, if we keep having con systems, that we can equalize the con a bit more across the genders. The Constitution or build version of weight is also a little inelegant. It feels a little weird to have an extra stat that functions differently than other stats in that it doesn't grow and also just affects a couple relatively minor things compared to other stats. Besides how it influences rescue, con is functionally just weird, less important speed for most units. This is especially the case when build came back and engaged, but now there's no rescuing, so it's an extra stat for weapon weight. For me, it feels a little awkward. Also, going back to Thracia, something unique about that system is that there is an exception in it for tome users. Tome users don't get to subtract their con from weapon weight, they just have to live with however heavy their tome is. The consequences of being a nerd, I guess. Tellius keeps weapon weight, but includes a new way of mitigating it. Instead of subtracting con or build from weapon weight to calculate attack speed, we subtract strength from it. So a unit with 10 strength doesn't lose speed to a weapon with 10 weight, but a unit with 5 strength loses 5 speed while using the same weapon. Interestingly, this makes strength a relevant stat for mages because it helps them not be weighed down by heavier tomes. I don't love this system. Strength is already generally a very good stat in Fire Emblem, and I feel like it didn't need another thing to do. It reminds me of earlier Fire Emblem games where weight being mitigated only by speed made speed feel really good. Here, strength feels really good. There's a bit of a rich get richer effect too when an already good stat mitigates weapon weight as well. Units with low strength already struggle in other games, and using heavier weapons could at times be a way to mitigate that weakness, but with weight tied to strength, a low strength unit that doesn't have enough speed to deal with weight penalties is pretty much out of luck. The one point I will give this system is that it's very intuitive. It makes sense that strength lets you wield heavier weapons, but I don't like how important it makes strength feel. An interesting thing about tying weight penalties to a stat that many units have a good growth in is that it becomes possible for units to gain multiple points of functional speed in a single level. For example, Boyd is weighed down by every axe in Path of Radiance at base, so a point of strength gives him just as much attack speed as a point of speed does, and if you hit both in one level, Boyd's attack speed basically just increased by 2. Of course, this trend only continues until Boyd's strength exceeds the weight of the axes you want him to use, but it can make some early level ups pretty exciting. Hitting an early speed strength level up on Boyd feels really good, and up to this point the only other game you could get that in was Thracia, but it wasn't too common in Thracia since build growths in that game tended to be pretty low. Another consequence of tying weight penalties to strength is that for many units, weapon weight eventually just stops mattering. Your physical attackers will usually have enough strength eventually, and then you get to just pretend weight doesn't exist. It's just a matter of when that happens. Boyd, for example, stops being weighed down by all axes at 22. Most weaker units at least get to the point where they aren't losing speed on the important weapons, so it's less impactful after the early game. Shadow Dragon went back to the classic attack speed equals speed minus weight system from the first 4 Fire Emblems, but New Mystery of the Emblem and Awakening did something a little different. They got rid of weapon weight entirely. And I gotta be honest, I didn't hate not having it for a few games. I enjoy the tactical decisions encouraged by weapon weight in theory, but usually the decisions aren't that interesting. You just have to remember a couple different doubling thresholds for each unit so you know when you can use heavier weapons. In theory, I like how weight systems can differentiate what weapons units can use, but even in Constitution systems, I feel it's only a differentiator for a few units each game, as really fast units can ignore it to a large extent, and it doesn't help slow units because at the end of the day, whether they're losing speed to weight or not, they're still slow. In New Mystery and Awakening, units just want to use the best weapon available to them, and when to use and not to use a weapon becomes more a game of resource management, at least in the early and mid-game where you have a limited amount of the powerful weapons available to you. In the later game, you'll often just outfit your units with a bunch of good weapons, but I don't hate that either. Naturally, this system means that you spend a little less time using iron weapons when better things are available, but I like there being less discouragement from using the exciting, fun weapons, especially since a lot of Fire Emblem players, including myself sometimes, have a tendency to end the game with a bunch of cool weapons in their convoy because they just use irons 90% of the time. One neat side effect of getting rid of weight is that it also gives designers a little more space to work with for enemies. In previous games, things like Steel Lance Pegasus Knights are a bit of a meme because they weigh themselves down so much that even your slower units can double them. In Awakening and New Mystery, this isn't an issue. Of course, this could also be solved by just not giving enemies weapons they can't use, but it's nice that removing weight allows for more weapon variety on enemies without them becoming pushovers. Anyway, replaying Awakening and New Mystery recently convinced me that weight isn't a super important thing that we necessarily have to have every game. There are still plenty of tactical decisions to be made in these games, even regarding what weapons to outfit a unit with. Fire Emblem Fates is our next game, and that didn't bring back weapon weight, but it did add a new feature to encourage units to use different weapons in the form of debuffs. This was important because weapon durability went away in this game, so there had to be some new reason not to just use silver weapons all the time. In Fates, most weapons that aren't iron weapons have certain side effects. For example, using a steel weapon gives you 3 less speed when determining if you can follow-up attack. Silver weapons reduce your stats after combat, brave weapons can't quad attack on enemy phase, etc. I actually really like this system on paper. It differentiates weapons in a way that's a little more interesting than the weapon weight system. Weapons all have drawbacks, but those drawbacks are different and may encourage you to use weapons for specific use cases. For example, if you have a unit that just needs to do a couple combats during a chapter, and those combats are spread apart across multiple turns, you might consider having them use a silver weapon because they'll recover from the stat penalty before each fight. The problem is that, in practice, a forged iron or bronze weapon can meet a lot of your needs in this game, to the point where it's often not worth taking the penalty from using a higher tier weapon when you can hit your benchmark with a lower tier weapon without taking the penalty. Another issue with this system is that the cost of weapons doesn't always accurately reflect the disparity in their quality. In Fates, is the silver sword really 4 times better than the iron sword or 8 times better than the bronze sword? I would say no, but that's the cost difference between them, so there's a strong disincentive from buying a silver sword. Still, I like the idea of this system a lot, and I wouldn't mind seeing it iterated on. I think a system where you couldn't just hit many benchmarks with forged bronzes, or where the weapon debuffs were designed a little differently, could be pretty cool. Three Houses is the next game with a different weight system. In that game, your attack speed is equal to your speed minus the weapon's weight minus your strength divided by 5. So like in Tellius, strength is the mitigating factor for weapon weight here, but dividing it by 5 means units take a while to grow out of their weapon weight issues, if they grow out of them completely at all. 3 houses gave us a new way to mitigate weight though, in the form of the weight -3 and weight -5 skills. Units can pick these skills up by training in heavy armor, and they do exactly what they say on the tin: take 3 or 5 off a weapon's weight when calculating attack speed. In this game, weight is really relevant in the early game. You haven't had a chance to build your super units yet, and enemies are legitimately threatening, especially when they double you. At this point in the game, weight matters a lot. You might unequip a unit or trade them a lighter weapon for enemy phase just so that they don't get doubled and killed. And units don't always grow out of their weight issues too quickly. Eventually, Edelgard will stop being weighed down by some axes, for example, but she's weighed down by an iron axe until she hits 35 strength, and that's going to be a minute. This is where the weight minus skill starts to become interesting. If you want a unit to quickly be less weighed down, you can train them up to C armor and pick up weight -3. For a lot of units, this will be a detour, because you'd like them to be training in other skills for class exams or for combat art access. So I think it's an interesting decision point where a unit might want to train in armor for a little bit just to get that weight -3, or you might suck it up and live with the weight penalty on a unit for a while so that they can train other things instead. Notably, in the late game, regardless of whether you fixed weight, it becomes a little less important, because your good combat arts and builds start to come online. If you're one-shotting enemies with brave arts or vantage wrathing, it becomes a lot less problematic to be weighed down compared to the early game, where you don't have access to those tools. So I like this system. I think it's pretty neat. I still don't love that strength is the mitigating stat for weight though. As I mentioned previously, Fire Emblem Engage brought back the build stat, and it works pretty similarly to the way that it did in Thracia, where build is a stat that can grow. Most of what I said for Thracia and GBA Emblem also applies here, but Engage adds a couple new ways of mitigating weight. First, the Build Plus skill can be inherited from Leif, and certain emblems like Sigurd and Leif give you a bonus to your build when the unit is holding them. Being able to hold emblems that improve build is a more important piece of the puzzle here than being able to inherit Build Plus 3. Sadly, there's rarely a reason to use Build Plus 3 because for the same amount of SP, you could just get Speed Plus 3 from Lyn. And speed is always at least as good as build and often better. If Build Plus cost less SP or gave more build, there could be some incentive to use it, but as it stands, Speed Plus is the better option most of the time. Still, I like that there are emblems that increase a unit's build. It adds an extra layer of consideration on who you should use the Leaf Ring on. Putting him on a unit like Lapis makes her faster with most weapons, while putting him on someone like Boucheron wouldn't. Since not every unit can have one of the speed rings all the time, a Build Plus emblem is a lot more interesting to me than the Build Plus skill, which is rarely going to be inherited when you could just do Speed Plus 3 instead. So that's weapon weight across the series, and honestly, I'm surprised it hasn't been experimented with more. Most games have some variation of attack speed equals speed minus weight minus some weight mitigating stat. But this isn't the only way that weight could look. If the point of weight is to differentiate how units perform with different weapons, there are lots of ways to do that. Weight penalties could be to hit or might instead of speed, for example, or if you wanted to be really harsh, certain weapons could just have con requirements to even use. Any of these versions of weight would make con an actual meaningful stat for slow units, which I kinda like. Currently, if you're slow, con just doesn't matter that much, except to prevent you from being doubled, because you aren't doubling with anything anyway. But if it affected weapon might or accuracy, a slow unit could have the niche of being more powerful or more accurate with powerful weapons. Or in the version where there are weapons you just can't use without adequate con, they'd have access to some unique and powerful weapons. I don't know that any of these are great solutions. I'd have to give them some more thought, but my point is just that there's a ton of different ways to differentiate how units use different weapons, and we haven't really seen too much experimentation here. This is part of why I like the idea of Fate system a lot and would love to see it iterated on. The differences between the weapons in those games are a lot more interesting than they are in other games, even if they turned out to be a little too much. I also don't mind the occasional no-weapon weight game. Weight can be an interesting tactical factor at times in influencing how you choose your weapon, but often it's either not relevant enough to the point where it can be ignored, or it can fail to differentiate units in an interesting way. When I go from Tellius to Shadow Dragon to New Mystery, I can't say I miss the weight mitigation stat much in Shadow Dragon, and I don't miss weight that much when I play New Mystery. I think there are probably more interesting ways to differentiate weapons than weapon weight, and it often fails to make interesting distinctions between units. So that's my thoughts on weapon weight. But what do you think about it, and which game has your favorite version? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Big thank you to my patrons Danny Doyle, Acrobatic Jazz, and Helix for helping to support my content. If you want to support the content, get shoutouts and early access to videos, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the video description. Otherwise, if you liked this video, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload, or hop in the Discord channel in the video description to come chat about Fire Emblem more. Either way, thanks for stopping by, and have yourself a lovely week.